Chapter 4 of Part 1 from The Devils by Dostoevsky. One day, just at the time of the first rumors about the emancipation of the serfs, when the whole of Russia suddenly rejoiced and was making preparations to be completely regenerated, a Petersburg baron, a man of the highest connections who was closely associated with the reform, paid a call on Mrs. Stavrogin while passing through our town. Mrs. Stavrogin valued such visits greatly because her connections with high society were growing weaker and weaker since the death of her husband, and in the end ceased altogether. The baron spent an hour with her and took tea. There was no one else there, but Mrs. Stavrogin did invite Stepan Verkovensky and exhibited him. The baron had heard something about him before, or pretended to, but he spoke very little to him at tea. Mr. Verkovensky was naturally anxious to make a good impression, and besides, his manners were most exquisite. Though he was not apparently very high-born, yet it happened to that since his earliest childhood he had been brought up in an aristocratic house in Moscow, and consequently decently. He spoke French like a Parisian. The baron ought therefore to have realized at the first glance the sort of people with whom Mrs. Stavrogin surrounded herself, even if she did live in the seclusion of a provincial town. But things did not turn out like that. When the baron positively confirmed the absolute authenticity of the first rumors of the great reform, which had just then been spread abroad, Mr. Verkovensky was unable to control his enthusiasm and cried, "Hurrah!" accompanying his exclamation with a gesture of the hand expressing his great delight at the news. His exclamation was not too loud and rather elegant. Indeed, his enthusiasm, too, was not entirely spontaneous, and he had carefully rehearsed his gesture in front of a mirror half an hour before the tea party. But something had apparently gone amiss, for the baron permitted himself a faint smile, though he at once put in a polite phrase about the universal and proper way in which all Russian hearts had been touched by the great event. He soon left, and before leaving, did not forget to offer 2 fingers to Mr. Verkovensky. When she returned to the drawing-room, Mrs. Stavrogin at first said nothing for 3 minutes, pretending to be looking for something on the table. But suddenly she turned to Mr. Verkovensky and, with a pale face and flashing eyes, hissed in a whisper, "I shall never forgive you for this." Next day she met her friend as though nothing had happened. She never referred to the incident again, but 13 years later, at a tragic moment, she remembered it and reproached him with it, and she turned pale, just as she had done 13 years before, when she had reproached him for the first time. Only twice in her life had she said to him, "I shall never forgive you for this." The incident with the baron was the second time, but the first incident also was so characteristic and apparently played so great a part in shaping Mr. Verkovensky's future that I must refer to it too. It took place in 1855 in springtime, in the month of May, just after the news had reached Shkovershniki that Lieutenant General Stavrogin, a foolish old gentleman, had died of acute indigestion on the way to Crimea, where he was hastening to join the army on active service. Mrs. Stavrogin, having been left a widow, went into mourning. It is true there was no reason why she should mourn a great deal, for she had spent the last 4 years in complete separation from her husband, owing to the incompatibility of their characters, and she was giving him an allowance. The lieutenant general himself only had 150 peasants, and his army pay, in addition to his position and his connections. All the money of Skvoreshniki belonged to Mrs. Stavrogin, the only daughter of a very rich government contractor. She was nevertheless shocked by the suddenness of the news and retired into complete seclusion. Mr. Verkovensky, needless to say, was always at her side. It was the height of May. The evenings were extraordinarily fine. The wild cherry was in flower. The two friends met each evening in the garden and sat till nightfall in the summer house, pouring out their hearts to one another. There were romantic moments. Under the influence of the change in her position, Mrs. Stavrogen talked more than usual. She seemed to cling to her friend, and so it went on for several evenings. A strange idea suddenly occurred to Mr. Verkovensky. Was the inconsolable widow counting on him by any chance to make her a proposal of marriage at the end of the year of mourning? It was a cynical idea, but then the very fact that a man dwells among the stars sometimes increases his disposition to cynical thoughts, if only because his spiritual development is so many-sided. He began to consider it carefully and came to the conclusion that it looked very much like it. He thought it over. It is true she has an enormous fortune, and to be sure, Mrs. Stavrogen was not exactly a beauty. She was a tall, bony woman with a yellow complexion and an exceedingly long, horsey face. Mr. Verkovensky hesitated more and more. He was tortured by doubts and even cried a few times from indecision. He wept rather frequently. In the evenings, that is to say, in the summer house, his face involuntarily began to assume a capricious and ironical expression, a cross between something coquettish and supercilious. Um, supercilious. I don't know what the fuck that is. This happens somehow of itself and involuntarily. And indeed, the more honorable the man, the more noticeable it is. Goodness only knows what the truth of the matter was, but it is most likely that there was nothing stirring in Mrs. Stavrogen's heart that could have fully justified Mr. Verkovensky's suspicions. And besides, she would never have agreed to change her name of Mrs. Stavrogen for his name, even if it were as renowned as hers. Quite possibly, it was just a womanly desire on her part to make herself agreeable to a man. A manifestation of an unconscious feminine yearning which is so natural in certain extremely feminine circumstances. However, I won't vouch for it. The depths of a woman's heart have remained unexplored to this day. But to continue, I dare say she soon guessed the meaning of the strange expression on her friend's face. She was very sensitive and observant, while he was a little too innocent at times. But the evenings went on as before, and their conversations were as poetic and interesting as ever. Then one day, at nightfall, they parted very amicably after a highly animated and poetical conversation, pressing each other's hands warmly at the steps of the cottage which Mr. Verkovensky occupied. Every summer he moved from the huge Shavorshniki mansion into the little cottage which stood almost in the garden. He had only just gone in and sunk into unhappy meditation, taken a cigar and without lighting it stopped, weary and motionless, before the open window, gazing at the little white clouds, light as fluff, gliding around the bright room, when suddenly a faint rustle made him start and turn around. Miss Stavrogen, whom he had left only for 4 minutes earlier, was again standing before him. Her yellow face was almost blue, her lips were pressed tightly together and twitching at the corners. For 10 full seconds she looked into his eyes in silence with a firm, implacable gaze. And then she whispered rapidly, "I shall never forgive you for this." When 10 years later Mr. Verkovensky told me the sad tale in a whisper, having previously locked the door, he vowed that he had been so stunned at the time that he had not heard or seen Mrs. Stavrogen go, as she never once alluded to that incident again, and as everything went on as though nothing had happened. He was all his life inclined to think that it was just a hallucination before an illness, particularly as he had in fact fallen ill that night and was ill for a fortnight, which incidentally put an end to their meetings in the summer house. But in spite of his notion that it was only a hallucination, he apparently waited every day all his life for the continuation and, as it were, the denouement of that incident. He could not believe that that was the end of it, and if so, he must have looked strangely sometimes at his friend. End of chapter 4.